Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has conducted a grand military parade to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the country's victory during the Second World War. Together with more than a dozen global leaders, President Xi Jinping attended the parade and delivered a speech pledging the country's commitment to peaceful development. 80 years on, how shall we review the human catastrophe of World War II? How can the world move forward in peace to prevent such wars from ever happening again? And what is the message China wishes to send to the world on this historical occasion? Join us for our discussion today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, and Professor Rosario Malindog-Uy, Director and Vice President for External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute. Welcome to the show. And I will start with you. So I'm sure you have followed the development of this massive military parade and also the speech given by President Xi Jinping. So what's your take of this event?
I think first and foremost, I would like to congratulate the PRC, President Xi Jinping, and the whole Chinese nation for a very momentous and very grand occasion. It was really a very inspiring and a momentous event. But for me, what I got when it comes to message of the whole event, especially the parade, as it is the 80th commemoration of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War, is that it was about honoring the sacrifices of millions and reminding the world that peace was won at a great cost. Western critics may have a different perspective, but I think the Asian countries and even beyond Asia has that message that they got from the whole event. And in terms of the message of President Xi, I think President Xi's speech actually emphasized or reframed World War II history to emphasize the Communist Party's role and legitimacy and its leadership, especially during the time, during the Second World War, that it was at the forefront of the fight against the Japanese and at the forefront at the fight of against fascism. So this is not just domestically some kind of recognition or legitimacy, but as a foundation for international legitimacy and global governance.
Well, Zhao Hai, of course, from the display of the Chinese modern defense capabilities, which is impressive, obviously. How does this event will help strengthen the Chinese position as a defender of the post-World War II global order and also the Chinese contribution during the Second World War?
Well, thank you for having me, Qinduo. I think if we look at history, looking back in history, we have to think about compare the historically weak China to contemporary China. What happened to a weak China is that not just China itself, but China's surrounding countries are under attack from the imperialists, from the colonialists continuously. And China suffered 14 years of Japanese invasion. And there are 35 million people sacrificed because of the war. So today, I think drawing the historical lesson from that very painful history, Chinese people knows the importance of having a strong army to defend itself, not only itself, but its neighbors and the region and enlarge the global system. So that is very important. And secondly, I think with this strong army showing to the world, that means when China is defending peace, its message will be very, very well received by any potential offenders. So if anybody wants to violate China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, or to bully the countries that are friendly to China, or trying to break the international system, violate the international law, then they will have to deal with a very strong, very capable, and very much modernized revolution army from this side of the Pacific Ocean. So again, I think this parade is not just showing, as you said, a very advanced military hardware, but also a very clear message, even though President Xi only spoke about 7-8 minutes, but I think it's short but very powerful. I think now the message is right now reverberating around the globe.
Well, and speak of defending post-World War order. One key part in this region is Taiwan being part of China. Taiwan and surrounding islands was handed back to China, at the end of the Second World War, and was well recorded in important documents like, Carroll Declaration, Potsdam Declaration, that kind of historical documents there. But of course, we know, this is a question, an issue right now ongoing, let's say, between China and the U.S., in general, the West. Some people are supporting independent Taiwan, separatist forces there. We Asian people here understand, the danger of doing that. But it seems to some others, they would say, oh, we need to, somehow, Taiwan is a tool, is a weapon against China, fits very well for this containment of China's strategy. What do you make of that?
I think this is a current geopolitical order problem, and not necessarily a problem, but it's much more of a challenge. And of course, the Taiwan question is part of it, because as we can see, and as we have been discussing for a long time, that even in your program that I was here before, and many other occasions, that Taiwan it becomes like a flashpoint in the Asia Pacific region when you talk about geopolitics, and when you talk about the United States trying to help to preserve its dominance and and hegemony in the Asia Pacific region, using Taiwan and even my country, the Philippines, against China when you talk about its Indo-Pacific strategy and containment strategy. But I think the 80th celebration and the demonstration, the military parade of China that we have witnessed, is really a message sending a signal to the West, to the collective West, especially to the United States, that China is strong, and China is resolute. It has its own determination that it will preserve historical truths, and it will never allow historical revisionism. That Taiwan is indeed a part of China, and it's a strong signal that really China, given its sophistication in terms of its military advancement and military modernization, that it is ready anytime that it has to act in terms of safeguarding its sovereign and territorial sovereignty. So that's actually the message that I get when you talk about these issues. But of course, China also, with the theme of the whole V parade and all the whole celebration, which is remembering history, honoring heroes, and cherishing peace and creating the future. I think China also frames that it is a moral custodian of peace. That when you talk about conflict, when you talk about resolution of even the Taiwan Strait question, it would want to always choose the path of negotiation and diplomacy, and it is a patient, major global actor, and and also a regional actor in the Asia Pacific. So it's more like that. I think the problem with the West is, like, even now they are perceiving, from what I read from the news and the commentaries right after the whole celebration, some of the people from the West is perceiving it as, the whole military parade as a threat or a sign of militarism, but actually it is not. It is actually a sign that, China has risen. However, it wants to be a custodian of peace, and it's a custodian of historical truths. And part of that historical truth is Taiwan is a part, and that would never change a part of China.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Anna. Zhao Hai, also want to have your opinion for this, the response, in the sense, from U.S. President Donald Trump in a social media post. He talked about, with the hope, like, China remember that the contribution by the Americans during the Second World War, during the, war of resistance against Japanese aggression. Personally, I think there's a well documented about the flying tigers, Doolittle readers, and that kind of assistance to the Chinese people. I think we are always grateful to the outside help from Americans, from other countries. But I know you just got back from the U.S. So your observation there?
Well, obviously, Trump is wrong. because it's not that the Chinese people don't remember the historical contribution from American volunteers or American people's help during the time of war. It's right now the United States, because of geopolitical reasons, refuse to remember or commemorate the 80th anniversary against the Japanese aggression together with the Chinese people, particularly the Chinese government. I think in the among the people to people, there's still a lot of Americans who remember that history. And also, if you look at what happened in China, China has museums set up for the flying tigers, for the sacrificed fallen soldiers from the United States. And also China has all kinds of activities. During the parade, if you noticed, China invited the family members of the flying tigers and other American volunteers to come to observe the military parade together. So again, I think to forget history is actually a betrayal. And right now, the American government, in order to so-called compete with China, choosing to forget about history. And this is very much a betrayal of history, and it's in danger of repeating the history. I want to follow up with one point, which is if you look at the origin of the World War II, it's actually happened within the West. It's not a war between the East and the West. And today, some of the Western media trying to portray a strong China as a threat to the West, and therefore expecting some kind of a conflict between the East and West. And China has no intention of doing that. Indeed, today, still, the problems is within the West. They are fighting left and right. So that there is the danger of a spillover effect. So that's why it's very important China and other global South countries maintain a very strong defense. Because if the West internal conflict cannot spill over to the developing world, then they will have to resolve their problem within, and then we can maintain a peace for a much longer period of time.
Well, and also in the post, Trump said that it seems like he's not happy with 26 global leaders gathering in Beijing for this occasion. He said that he accused these other national leaders. Quote here: "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America." End quote. So, how do you describe his sentiment here?
I think President Trump is way too. I think there are two things that I can say and analyze his reaction to the event and to the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the war against fascism. I think he is either bitter or he is paranoid. That's my impression. Precisely because for me, as the president of the United States, and you have seen that something very historic and very important to commemorate, as far as human history is concerned, you should be happy. You should not be bitter or some kind of paranoid. And also take note, it's not only President Putin and the president or the leader of North Korea that were invited to the event. There were other world leaders who were here and in Beijing. So I mean, for me, Trump should just be more gracious, I think, and should not paint a color about all of these things. Because in the very first place, it's just show either that he's bitter, he's paranoid, or it's a sign of insecurity. So that's my reaction to the post of, with due respect to the President of the United States.
Zhao Hai, anything to add?
Well, just look at who's attending the military parade, right? And if you look at what happened in the United States in June when President Trump is holding a military parade, nobody's actually showing up from international community. And when China is holding this particular commemoration, there are like 49 leaders from 49 countries and basically top leaders from 26. And all the Chinese neighboring countries, excluding probably India, are all showing up. And there's, of course, some problem right now with the Philippines, but I believe in the future it will improve. So altogether, I think people realize that China is trying to remember history and move forward with a brighter future for mankind. The bitterness and the paranoia that Anna mentioned is really limited to a small group of people who still very close-minded and don't know exactly where the world is actually going.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Zhao Hai, for speaking to us. Earlier, I also spoke with Nell Callaway, granddaughter of a Flying Tigers commander, General Claire Chennault, and also CEO of the Chennault Aviation and Military Museum. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello, Nell. Welcome to the show. So most of the people, as far as I know, they have heard of flying tigers, especially in China. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of them are not that aware of the whole story. So please continue to tell us some of, how was the group formed in the first place, and what kind of role did your grandfather, General Chennault, played in assembling such a group?
My grandfather came to China in 1937 to do a survey of the Chinese Air Force. He arrived in June, and in the middle of June, he did a survey of the Air Force and discovered that China only had 91 operational planes at that time. They thought they had 500, but they only had 91 that flew. And so he knew that this was a 4,500-mile journey that he wrote to my mother that he was going on. And that 4,500-mile journey, he discovered that, but I think he also witnessed firsthand what the Japanese were doing to Chinese people. And he had great compassion for that. The war started just a few weeks after that. He offered his services to China, and they were accepted, and he was put as the chief air advisor to the Chinese Air Force. So he actually served in the Chinese Air Force for 4 years. Before the Tigers were formed, he was able to do many, many things with Chinese people. They established an early warning system. He established a network of people who were willing to come build the runways, because the first thing the Japanese did when they came to the villages would be to bomb the runways so the planes couldn't take off. The early warning system actually saved millions of Chinese lives. It was the very first time the Chinese people ever had a chance to run for cover. And then also it allowed those 91 airplanes to get airworthy before the Japanese got to the villages at times. So that was really important. The Russians obviously were helping the Chinese at that time. And around 39, 40, the Russians had to go home because the Germans were coming to Russia. And so that left China once again without a source for airplanes and extra pilots, if you will. So it was decided then that my grandfather, General Chennault, and some Chinese businessmen would come to the United States to ask for aid. Mm-hmm. And they left China. I have his logbook. They left China in October of 1940, and they arrived in China, in the U.S., basically in the early 1941, and they started talking to Roosevelt and negotiating with him. Eventually, he signed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing China to purchase 100 P-40 airplanes, P-40B airplanes. Also, he gave Chennault and his men a letter to allow them onto the military bases to find pilots and support crew. Mm-hmm. He was able to find 100 pilots and around 200 support crew to do that. Well, that was a very difficult time, making arrangements to bring 100 pilots, 200 support crew, get 100 airplanes to China was not an easy task.
Not at all.
But not at all. The first group eventually left around July of 1941, and the last group got there in November of 1941. But he had a lot of training to do because a lot of them had never even seen a P-40 airplane before. So he had his work cut out to teach them the tactics that they would need to be able to do battle against the Japanese.
Well, of course, that's a volunteer group, what we call Flying Tigers. At that time, that's years before the Pearl Harbor attack. What made your grandfather recognize, fully that that was necessary, probably, the importance of the China battlefield against the Japanese? Of course, in addition, there is the European theater, but this is Asian theater there. And, do we have any clue? He was, so aware of the danger. Somehow he has to, had to bring people with him to the China battlefield to help the Chinese.
When he arrived in 1937, you're correct in that. He did have, he kind of understood that eventually there would be a war in China with the Japanese. But he also, in his book, he writes about the fact that by helping China, he was actually helping China to defeat the Japanese before they came to America. So he had a great sense of the fact that the Japanese were not going to stop with China. And, that proved to be true. He actually, back in the 1920s, he had an inkling that maybe Japan would one day come in contact or come up against the United States. So he was very attuned to the political situation of the day and very astute in his assumptions because obviously eventually they did attack the United States at Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941.
Well, you have dedicated yourself to preserve, of course, your grandfather's legacy with this project of Chennault Aviation and Military Museum. So what made you take on this role?
Well, it was really personal. The museum itself is in one of the last remaining buildings of the largest navigation school in the whole United States in World War II. We actually graduated 15,000 navigators, and this building is our largest artifact because it was an office building and a classroom for these navigators. So we actually supplied about a third of the navigators that would eventually go to China. And then, of course, my grandfather lived in Monroe, Louisiana, and that was where I visited him when I was a young girl. And, it was a special place in my heart. We were living in Monroe. So when we were asked to set up the Chennault room in there, that became very personal. But my mother and I don't really think we fully, either one of us understood what had happened in China until we visited China for the very first time in 2002. And we heard the stories firsthand personally. A lot of the veterans were still alive at that time, and they would tell us the stories of what was going on in China and the devastation that it had experienced during that time. And it made us aware that Americans don't know that story. My mother, even being his daughter, his youngest daughter of 8 children, wasn't aware of what was going on in China and what he was truly able to accomplish until we came to China and we heard the stories.
Of course, today, when we remember the past, but also it has a lot to do with today, like there are, let's say, kind of tensions between China and the U.S., two great countries. But you said it very well about, we should put aside probably the differences of ideology, systems, cultures, traditions. We are people, we are human beings, we care each other. Do you think that's kind of inspiration probably? We should learn, we should borrow for today when we deal with each other?
I think it is. And you asked me about the museum. That is one of the things that when my mother and I returned from the trip in 2002, we actually just decided that it was so necessary for us to really talk about the Chinese and what they experienced and what they were able to go through. Because with the Chinese, the tenacity that they had, the willingness that they had to give all is so inspirational. And I think, we are different in our cultures, but we are people. And I think if we learn to appreciate the differences, which, even in family members, you have to appreciate differences. It doesn't have anything to do with the nationality. It just has to do with the different personalities. So I think that that's really necessary for us to learn to put those aside and to look for the good in people and to look for what we can learn from them.
Yeah, what was it like, your first visit in China, and then what was it like for people when you told your story or your visit, your experience in China back in the States?
Well, it's amazing to me because I speak often to groups in the United States. Most people don't know that. They don't understand that. That is why remembering history is so extremely important because, that history and looking at what the Chinese were able to accomplish for 10 years before the Flying Tigers ever arrived in China. The will to keep on fighting, if you will, even though they were greatly outnumbered militarily, not in people, but I just think that it's just something that Americans don't know about, and I try to make it my job to teach them about how great the Chinese people are and how much I think of them, how we've been treated in China so graciously and honorably, and it's because the Chinese people honor their history and their heroes.
Right, well said. Of course, given what we have today in the world, in ongoing conflicts, geopolitical tensions, of course, disruption in global trade, for example, they are creating this kind of uncertainty, people have about the future. So probably this is a period we especially need this kind of spirit, carried by your grandfather and his colleagues. But in what way? And how should the story of the Flying Tigers be told to better promote understanding and acceptance, among young people, in particular, in the international community?
Yeah, I think it's when you talk. I've had the opportunity. I'm old enough to where I knew a lot of the World War II veterans before most of them have passed away at this time, and we also do oral histories at our museum. I've interviewed a lot of them and heard their stories, and all of them, bar none, have always said when they were telling me the stories of the Chinese people that they thought of them as brothers. They were rescuers. They did so many things to, they fought together side by side. When you're in a war together, just think about that. You never really look at that other person and say he's different than I am. You're really just wanting to be a brother and fighting for the same cause, right? And so I think that is the spirit that we can, if we're all fighting for the same cause, which is peace, then there is a brotherhood in that, rather than always the conflict that sometimes the world would have us be in conflict. But if we really look at each other as all having common interests, all having common goals to want to live in peace, raise our families, and give our children a better chance and a better life than even we have experienced. Because 80 years ago, there were millions of lives that were lost to give us the lives that we have today. We don't want that to happen again. We want to make sure. I think of it as, peace is not a gift that we receive. It is a responsibility that we must carry. And it is our responsibility to make sure that same responsibility is passed on to our future generations.
Well, thank you, Nell. Thank you for speaking to us.
I appreciate it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. And may we all work for peace.